the controversial electorate, independent voters, third parties, and the disruption of the American political duopoly. Introduction: the emergence of a controversial paradigm. In the contemporary American political landscape, the two-party system is increasingly besieged by a growing, volatile, and highly scrutinized demographic, the independent voter. The electorate's steady departure from traditional partisan affiliation has fundamentally altered electoral calculus, transforming independent voters and third-party candidates into the primary arbiters of national political power. This shift has precipitated a unique linguistic and cultural framing within political discourse. Because independent voters and the alternative parties they sometimes support introduce profound unpredictability into a tightly managed duopoly, they are frequently characterized by political elites as disruptive, illegitimate, or fundamentally controversial. To suggest that the independent voting bloc should be termed the controversial party is to accurately diagnose their structural role in modern elections. They are the ultimate disruptors in a system designed for binary stability, operating as a decentralized faction that aggressively challenges the hegemony of the political establishment. The United States features a political architecture inherently hostile to forces outside the Democratic and Republican coalitions. Plurality voting and single-member districts systematically suppress multi-party competition, driving a phenomenon known as Duverger's law, which dictates that such electoral rules inevitably consolidate into two dominant parties. Within this rigid framework, any voter or candidate who refuses to align with the binary is treated not merely as an alternative, but as a systemic threat. Independent voters exhibit patterns of nonconformity, high ticket splitting rates, and a pronounced willingness to reject incumbents, making them the most volatile variable in modern campaigns. Their refusal to adhere to predictable voting patterns generates immense anxiety among partisan strategists, cementing their reputation as a highly controversial electoral element. Furthermore, the rise of independent voters is not an anomaly but a sustained, generational realignment. Data tracking voter identification indicates that independents now represent the largest single political bloc in the United States, surpassing both major parties by significant margins. Despite their numerical superiority, these voters face systemic disenfranchisement, exclusion from primary elections, and relentless rhetorical attacks from partisan loyalists who label them as spoilers or agents of democratic subversion. This report provides an exhaustive analysis of the independent electorate and third-party movements, exploring their demographic composition, their historical and contemporary electoral impact, the institutional hostility they face, and the structural reforms required to accommodate them. Ultimately, the analysis demonstrates why the independent faction, by virtue of its sheer size and systemic friction, has become the most controversial and decisive force in American politics. The taxonomy of independence: voters versus formal parties. A fundamental challenge in analyzing the impact of political independence in the United States is the semantic, psychological, and legal confusion surrounding the terminology. The term independent is applied simultaneously to individual voters who reject party labels, candidates who run outside the duopoly, and formally organized minor political parties. This overlap frequently results in severe voter confusion and complicates both electoral analysis and ballot access administration. Independent voters as electoral free agents. At the individual level, an independent voter, often referred to in varying state statutes as unaffiliated, unaligned, or non-affiliated, is a citizen who does not maintain a formal identification with or loyalty to a specific political party. The earliest conceptualization of the independent voter in political science defined them as individuals whose electoral choices were driven by specific issues and candidate evaluations rather than ideological tribalism or blind partisanship. Independent voters operate as the free agents of the electorate. They do not attend party fundraising galas, nor are they bound by the platform dictates of a central committee. However, political science literature often divides this massive bloc into two distinct subgroups: pure independents and partisan leaners. Polling data frequently reveals that when pressed, A significant portion of self-identified independents admit to leaning toward either the Democratic or Republican Party. These leaners often exhibit voting behaviors that are remarkably similar to weak partisans, consistently supporting their preferred party's candidates while avoiding the formal label. True or pure independents, who represent less than 10% of the public, typically demonstrate lower levels of political engagement, lower voter turnout, and a profound distrust of both major parties. Despite these academic distinctions, the aggregate bloc of self-identified independents acts as a critical swing constituency, demonstrating a pronounced willingness to shift their support entirely across different election cycles based on macroeconomic conditions and candidate quality. The semantic trap: formal independent parties. The concept of independence becomes highly controversial when formalized into actual political organizations. Voters seeking to register as unaffiliated frequently mistake formal, ideologically driven political parties bearing the name independent for a simple declaration of nonpartisanship. This semantic trap has profound implications for voter registration, primary participation, and the integrity of voter rolls. A prominent and deeply controversial example of this phenomenon is the American Independent Party, AIP, in California. Founded in 1967 by supporters of the segregationist former Alabama Governor George Wallace, the AIP evolved into an ultra-conservative, right-wing populist organization whose platform explicitly opposes abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and undocumented immigration. Despite its highly specific and far-right ideological platform, the AIP became California's largest third party, boasting nearly 500,000 registered members by 2016. Extensive polling and journalistic investigations, however, revealed that an estimated 73% of AIP members had registered for the party in error, mistakenly believing they were declaring themselves as unaffiliated voters who simply wished to be independent. This widespread confusion, exacerbated by the inclusion of the word independent in the party's name, routinely prevents voters from participating in closed presidential primaries, effectively disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of citizens through a linguistic misunderstanding. A parallel controversy occurred with the Independent Party of Oregon, IPO. Formed in 2006 as a centrist alternative advocating for campaign finance regulation, open primaries, and government transparency, the IPO rapidly grew to become the state's third-largest political party. The party's unprecedented growth was driven largely by voter frustration with the extreme polarization of the duopoly, but it also heavily benefited from the ambiguity of its name. In 2015, a survey sponsored by the Democratic Party of Oregon found that 46% of IPO members did not realize they were formally affiliated with a political party, with nearly a quarter explicitly believing they had registered as an unaffiliated voter. The profound confusion between being an independent voter and a member of the Independent Party led to legislative attempts by the established duopoly to force the IPO to change its name or disband, sparking fierce debates over ballot access, voter intent, and the right of association. These examples underscore how the very term independent has been heavily contested and weaponized, contributing to the controversial status of voters who attempt to operate outside the tightly controlled confines of the two-party system. Demographic metamorphosis and the rise of the independent majority. The classification of independent voters as a disruptive and controversial force is inextricably linked to their explosive demographic growth. For decades, the American electorate was neatly compartmentalized into robust Democratic and Republican strongholds, with independents serving as a small, marginal tie-breaking demographic whose influence was limited to the extreme margins of competitive elections. In the 21st century, however, this paradigm has entirely inverted. Independents no longer represent the margin, they represent the plurality, and their demographic composition suggests that this shift is permanent. Record-breaking identification rates. Longitudinal data from premier polling institutions such as Gallup and the Pew Research Center illustrate a stark, sustained, and accelerating departure from partisan affiliation. Since 1988, Gallup has tracked party identification, historically observing that independent affiliation experienced a roller coaster effect, rising in odd-numbered years when political engagement was low, and dipping sharply during highly polarized presidential election years when voters retreated to their partisan camps. However, this cyclical trend broke decisively during the 2024 election cycle. Despite the intense polarization and existential rhetoric that characterized the presidential race, independent identification remained remarkably steady, refusing to dip as it had in previous decades. By early 2025, Gallup reported that a record-high 45% of U.S. adults identified as political independents, surpassing previous records set in 2014, 2023, and 2024. In stark contrast, identification with the Democratic and Republican parties languished at 27% each, representing historic low points for unleaned party identification. In some state-level metrics, the shift is even more dramatic. In Colorado, for example, registered unaffiliated voters surpassed 50% of the total voting population by 2025. Year: Independent identification. Democratic identification. Republican identification. 1991. 33%. 36%. 31%. 2004. 31%. 34%. 34%. 2014. 43%. 30%. 26%. Year: Independent identification. Democratic identification. Republican identification. 2023. 43%. 27%. 27%. 2024. 43%. 28%. 28%. 2025. 45%. 27%. 27%. Table 1. Historical shifts in U.S. party identification. Source: Gallup tracking data. The data clearly indicates that the American electorate is actively shedding its partisan skin. The consistent growth of the independent bloc, particularly over the last 15 years, demonstrates a structural rejection of the two major parties, transforming the independent voter from a fringe participant into the central gravitational force of the American political cosmos. Generational replacement and the rejection of partisanship. The expansion of the independent electorate is not evenly distributed across the demographic spectrum. It is heavily driven by the mechanics of generational replacement. Historically, political science models suggested that while voters might exhibit weak party attachments in their youth, they would inevitably adopt firm, reliable partisan identities as they aged, bought homes, and paid taxes. This conventional wisdom has been thoroughly appended by millennials and Generation Z, who are actively defying historical trends by clinging to their political independence as they mature into middle age. According to comprehensive demographic analyses from Gallup, 52% of millennials born 1981 to 1996 and 52% of adult Generation Z voters currently identify as political independents. This represents a profound generational divide when compared to older cohorts, who remain tethered to the tribal politics of the 20th century. Only 33% of baby boomers and a mere 26% of the silent generation identify as independents, with these older demographic groups heavily anchoring the modern Republican and Democratic bases. Generation: Independent identification. Democratic identification. Republican identification. Generation Z adults: 52%. 31%. 17%. Millennials: 198119996. 52%. 27%. 21%. Generation X: 1965190. 44%. 28%. 28%. Baby boomers: 1946194. 33%. 32%. 35%. Silent Gen, 1928195. 26%. 35%. 39%. Asterisk Table 2, Generational Breakdown of U.S. Party Identification asterisk. This generational skepticism is rooted in a fundamental distrust of party elites and institutions. Surveys of younger voters indicate that roughly two-thirds do not believe that joining a political party makes their voice more powerful. Furthermore, significant percentages of young partisans feel that their own party organizations actively block their favored candidates from achieving electoral success to protect entrenched establishment figures. Consequently, younger voters view political independence not as an act of apathy, but as an active, calculated rejection of a cartel-like system that consistently fails to represent their material and ideological interests. Gender, education, and the ideological profile of the pragmatic independent. The controversial nature of independent voters is compounded by their complex demographic composition and ideological heterodoxy, which confounds the rigid platforms of the major parties. Examining the demographics of the independent bloc reveals significant divides based on gender and educational attainment, particularly when accounting for partisan leaners. Pew Research-centered data highlights a persistent and widening gender gap in partisan affiliation that permeates the independent-leaning cohorts. Women constitute a majority of Democratic leaners, while men constitute a commanding majority, 64%, of Republican leaners. Among pure independents, men also form a solid majority at 55%. Furthermore, educational attainment has become a major sorting mechanism. A majority of all voters with at least a four-year college degree identify as or lean toward the Democratic Party, while voters without a college degree, particularly white voters without college experience, have aggressively consolidated their alignment with the Republican Party. Despite these underlying demographic sorting mechanisms, independent voters as an aggregate overwhelmingly identify as moderate, roughly 54 to 60%, rejecting the bimodal extremism that characterizes contemporary partisan politics. Their policy preferences are highly pragmatic and selectively curated from both sides of the aisle, mirroring a modern version of classical liberalism. On macroeconomic issues, independent voters generally lean center-right. They prioritize fiscal responsibility, market competition, and individual choice. They are deeply concerned with inflation, taxes, and affordability, and they tend to express profound skepticism towards sweeping government expansion, preferring solutions that foster market-based efficiency over bureaucratic regulation. Conversely, on social issues, independents tend to lean left. They are highly protective of personal freedoms, socially tolerant, and prioritize issues such as reproductive rights and climate change mitigation. This unique ideological synthesis makes them a highly cohesive, yet deeply frustrating demographic for major party strategists. Independents trust Democrats more on abortion, healthcare, and the environment, while simultaneously trusting Republicans more on the economy, crime, and immigration. Because they evaluate issues holistically rather than adhering to a strict, prepackaged party line, they demand a level of nuance and cross-aisle compromise that the hyperpolarized duopoly is fundamentally unequipped to provide. This refusal to conform to ideological purity tests is precisely why they are branded as a controversial and disruptive element in modern political campaigns. The structural hostility of the two-party cartel. The characterization of independent voters and third parties as controversial is not merely a product of their ideological independence. It is a direct result of the structural design of the American political system. The United States operates under a framework of rules that aggressively protects the two-party duopoly while structurally disenfranchising alternative voices, turning the very act of voting independently into an act of systemic rebellion. Duverger's law and the winner-take-all framework. The foundation of the two-party cartel is built upon the mechanics of plurality voting within single-member districts. In this winner-take-all system, the candidate who receives the most votes in a given district wins the seat entirely, regardless of whether they achieve an absolute mathematical majority. Political scientists have long recognized that this specific electoral design inevitably leads to the consolidation of two dominant political parties, a principle known as Duverger's law. Under Duverger's law, voters rapidly realize that supporting a minor party or independent candidate is strategically risky, as it threatens to divide the vote among ideologically similar factions, thereby inadvertently electing the voter's least preferred candidate. Over time, this mathematical reality forces voters to coalesce around two broad coalitions, not necessarily because they enthusiastically support the major parties, but because the system penalizes nuance. Consequently, when independent candidates do emerge and voters choose to support them, they are violating the unwritten strategic rules of the plurality system, inviting intense backlash and the label of controversial. The two-party doom loop and pernicious polarization. As American politics has nationalized and sorted into two distinct, highly ideological coalitions, the stabilizing benefits of the two-party system have collapsed, giving way to what political scientists term the two-party doom loop. In this state of pernicious polarization, all political activity flattens into an all-encompassing, us against them, tribal conflict. The opposing party is no longer viewed as legitimate competition with differing policy prescriptions. Instead, they are characterized as an existential threat to the survival of the nation. This system-level extremism creates a bimodal distribution of political power, where the spatial and psychological separation between the two camps makes compromise impossible. In such a highly toxic environment, the independent voter becomes an anomaly. Because independent voters prioritize policy solutions over tribal warfare, they represent a threat to the highly lucrative polarization industry that sustains party fundraising, partisan media ecosystems, and ideological activism. The independent voters' desire to spoil toxic cycles of partisanship is fundamentally incompatible with a system that relies on constant, manufactured outrage to drive voter turnout. Institutional exclusion and closed primaries. The hostility toward the controversial party of independent voters is most explicitly codified in state election laws regarding primary participation. While independent voters represent nearly half the electorate, they are structurally excluded from the candidate selection process in vast swaths of the country. Currently, 15 states utilize fully closed congressional primaries, and 22 states hold closed presidential primaries, restricting participation strictly to registered members of the Democratic and Republican parties. This system systematically disenfranchises the nation's largest voting bloc. Across the country, an estimated 23.5 to 27 million independent voters are entirely barred from casting a ballot in primary elections. Because general elections in heavily gerrymandered congressional districts are often highly uncompetitive, the primary election is frequently the only consequential contest that determines representation. By locking independents out of this vital stage, the duopoly ensures that candidates are selected almost exclusively by the most extreme and highly partisan factions of the electorate. The independent voter is thus forced into a reactive posture, denied a voice in candidate selection, and presented with a deeply unsatisfactory binary choice between two highly polarized candidates in November. This deliberate institutional exclusion breeds massive civic resentment and ensures that when independents do vote in the general election, their actions are highly disruptive to the establishment's expectations. The anatomy of electoral disruption, the spoiler effect. If independent voters represent a controversial demographic, third-party and independent candidates represent controversial mechanics. While the two-party system effectively prevents independent candidates from securing outright victories, it does not strip them of their power. Since 1920, only a handful of third-party candidates have managed to win even a single electoral vote. However, their inability to win the presidency does not negate their profound influence over the outcome. Third parties exercise immense power through the spoiler effect, a mathematical vulnerability of plurality voting that makes them the most feared entities in partisan politics. The mechanics of the spoiler effect. The spoiler effect occurs when a non-winning candidate alters the outcome of an election simply by participating. When a third-party candidate enters a race, they naturally attract voters who share their specific ideological leanings or policy priorities. If the third-party candidate closely resembles one of the major party candidates, they will siphon votes primarily from that allied candidate. Consequently, the presence of a third alternative divides the majority coalition, inadvertently handing victory to the candidate whose ideology is most opposed by the majority of the electorate. This dynamic is inherently hostile to the independence of irrelevant alternatives criterion in social choice theory, which dictates that the introduction of a non-winning option should not change the preference ordering of the winning options. Because the mere participation of an outsider can flip an election result, independent candidates are aggressively branded as spoilers. This pejorative label is highly controversial because it weaponizes electoral mathematics to cast democratic participation as an act of sabotage. It relies on the arrogant assumption that a major party is entitled to the votes that went to the independent candidate, ignoring the fact that those voters may have abstained entirely if denied their preferred choice. Historical precedents of electoral disruption. The history of the American presidency is punctuated by fiercely controversial elections where third-party candidates decisively altered the trajectory of the nation through the spoiler effect. The election of 1912, the most dramatic instance of vote splitting, occurred when former President Theodore Roosevelt, frustrated by the conservative drift of his successor William Howard Taft, bolted from the Republican Party to form the progressive Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt ran a populist campaign advocating for women's suffrage, tariff reductions, and social reforms. He secured an unprecedented 27.4% of the popular vote and 88 electoral votes. However, by brutally splitting the Republican base, Roosevelt guaranteed a landslide electoral victory for Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who captured the presidency despite receiving only 41.8% of the popular vote. The election of 1992, independent billionaire Ross Perot launched a massive populist campaign centered on deficit reduction, political reform, and opposition to free trade agreements. Perot captured a staggering 18.9% of the popular vote, amounting to nearly 20 million votes. While political science debate continues regarding the exact distribution of his voters, with evidence suggesting he drew somewhat equally from both sides, Perot's massive share of the electorate undeniably disrupted the race between incumbent Republican George H.W. Bush and Democrat Bill Clinton. His presence fundamentally altered the national conversation, propelling the issue of fiscal responsibility to the forefront of American politics and forcing the major parties to adopt his platform. The election of 2000, the modern dread surrounding the spoiler effect was firmly cemented in the razor-thin contest between Republican George W. Bush and Democrat Al Gore. Green Party candidate Ralph Nader, running as a progressive consumer advocate, secured over 2.7 million votes nationally. The controversy reached its zenith in the decisive state of Florida. Bush ultimately won the state, and the presidency, by a microscopic margin of just 537 votes following a highly contentious Supreme Court ruling. In that same state, Nader captured over 97,000 votes. Democratic analysts forcefully argued that Nader's presence on the ballot siphoned critical progressive support away from Gore, explicitly costing the Democratic Party the presidency and sparking enduring hostility toward third-party movements on the political left. The election of 2016, a similar, highly controversial dynamic unfolded when Donald Trump narrowly defeated Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College. Green Party candidate Jill Stein and Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson collectively captured over 4% of the national vote, equating to nearly 6 million ballots. In critical blue wall battleground states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, Stein's vote totals exceeded Trump's extraordinarily narrow margin of victory over Clinton. Once again, major party loyalists directed intense vitriol at independent voters, viewing their refusal to support the lesser of two evils as an unforgivable abdication of civic responsibility that facilitated a catastrophic political outcome. Election year. Third, party/independent. Candidate. Popular vote share. Electoral impact/controversy. 1912. Theodore Roosevelt, progressive. 27.4%. Split Republican vote, electing Democrat Woodrow Wilson. 1968. George Wallace. American. Independent. 13.5%. 15 states demonstrated immense regional populist power. 1992. Ross Perot. Independent. 18.9%. Major disruptive force propelled federal deficit to top of agenda. 2000. Ralph Nader, Green. 2.7%. Received 97K votes in FL, widely blamed for Al Gore's defeat. 2016. Jill Stein, Green, / Gary Johnson, Lib. 4.3% combined. Stein's vote share exceeded Clinton's margin of loss in key Rust Belt states. Table 3. Notable third-party disruptions in modern U.S. presidential elections. The 2024 election, a case study in controversy and legal warfare. The 2024 presidential election cycle elevated the controversy surrounding independent candidates to unprecedented heights, showcasing both the disruptive power of the independent electorate and the extreme measures the duopoly will deploy to suppress them. Driven by historic dissatisfaction with the presumptive major party nominees, a highly mobilized cohort of independent options emerged early in the cycle, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cornel West, Jill Stein, and the well-funded centrist organization No Labels. The weaponization of the spoiler effect. The rhetorical reaction from the political establishment to this independent surge was fierce and immediate. Democratic operatives and allied organizations aggressively framed any third-party vote as a direct threat to the survival of the republic. Organizations like the centrist Democratic think tank Third Way published extensive reports arguing that independent bids were a dangerous illusion. They insisted that candidates from groups like No Labels possessed no viable path to 270 electoral votes and would strictly function as spoilers to re-elect Donald Trump. The narrative posited that the independent desire for a centrist alternative was a luxury the electorate could not afford, effectively demanding that voters suppress their true preferences to manage the fragile calculus of the duopoly. Conservative operatives mirrored this cynical manipulation of the spoiler effect. Recognizing the historical trend that left-wing independent candidates pull votes disproportionately from Democrats, Republican-aligned groups and lawyers actively worked to prop up the campaigns of Cornel West and Jill Stein in critical swing states. Republican strategists assisted these candidates in navigating complex ballot access laws in battlegrounds like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, explicitly hoping to siphon liberal voters away from Vice President Kamala Harris in a race expected to be decided by razor-thin margins. This blatant weaponization of third-party candidates underscores why they are viewed as deeply controversial. They are treated by the establishment not as legitimate vehicles for ideological expression, but as tactical munitions deployed to inflict collateral damage on political opponents. Legal warfare and the suppression of ballot access. Because the major political parties view independent voters and candidates as existential threats to their market share, they have constructed a labyrinth of institutional barriers designed to suppress competition. Ballot access laws in the United States are uniquely Byzantine, varying drastically by state and requiring enormous expenditures of time and capital to gather tens of thousands of petition signatures, resources that only established parties easily possess. In the 2024 election, this structural hostility erupted into outright legal warfare. The Democratic Party launched a massive, heavily funded legal assault aimed at striking independent and third-party candidates from the ballot across the nation. In Georgia, a crucial swing state, the Democratic Party successfully sued to bar independent candidate Cornel West and socialist candidate Claudia de la Cruz from the ballot, citing obscure technicalities regarding whether the candidates or their electors were required to file nomination petitions. They simultaneously challenged Green Party candidate Jill Stein and independent Robert F. Kennedy Jr., resulting in administrative rulings that kept them off the ballot or forced their withdrawal. Similar lawsuits were aggressively filed by Democrats in Wisconsin, Montana, and Nevada to suppress Green Party access and invalidate thousands of gathered voter signatures. Critics of the two-party system correctly pointed out the profound hypocrisy of this strategy. While the Democratic Party campaigned heavily on the theme of protecting democracy from authoritarian threats, they simultaneously utilized their vast legal resources to eliminate democratic choices, ensuring voters were restricted to a binary ballot. This aggressive legal gatekeeping reinforces the perception of the duopoly as an anti-competitive cartel that protects its power by actively disenfranchising alternatives, ensuring that the controversial party is smothered before the voters even reach the polls. Independent voter behavior, the decisive swing, and ticket-splitting rebellion. Despite the legal suppression of independent candidates, the power of the independent voter proved absolute in the 2024 presidential election. Operating as a masterclass in electoral volatility and strategic nonconformity, independent voters were the singular force that dictated the election's outcome, expanding their overall influence through massive turnout shifts and sophisticated ticket-splitting behavior. The definitive swing to the right. The allegiance of the independent voter is inherently conditional. In 2020, independent voters forcefully rejected Donald Trump, backing Democrat Joe Biden by a decisive 13 percentage point margin, 54% to 41%. This overwhelming support from unaffiliated voters was the indispensable cornerstone of the Democratic victory. However, plagued by profound concerns over inflation, the cost of living, and border security, independents executed a dramatic pivot in 2024. While Kamala Harris managed to win the independent vote nationally by a narrow 3-point margin, 49% to 46%, this represented a catastrophic 10 percentage point collapse in Democratic support among this cohort compared to the previous cycle. More importantly, the national aggregate masked critical geographical divergences. In the highly contested battleground states where the campaign was fought with maximum financial and rhetorical intensity, Donald Trump successfully captured the independent vote outright, securing vital margins in Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Battleground state. Independent voter winner, 2024. Arizona. Donald Trump. Georgia. Donald Trump. North Carolina. Donald Trump. Pennsylvania. Donald Trump. Michigan. Kamala Harris, plus 4 points. Wisconsin. Kamala Harris, plus 1 point. Nevada. Tied. Asterisk Table 4. Independent voter preferences in 2024 swing states asterisk. This massive swing was fundamentally rooted in policy trust rather than partisan affection. Post-election surveys indicated that among persuadable swing voters, Trump held massive advantages on the specific issues they prioritized. He led by 21 points on border security, 11 points on crime, and 9 points on the economy and cost of living. The independent electorate proved that they were willing to overlook Trump's personal controversies and systemic disruptions because they trusted his pragmatic approach to their material economic concerns. The ticket-splitting phenomenon. Perhaps the most fascinating metric of the 2024 election was the dramatic rate of ticket splitting, which conclusively demonstrated the intellectual autonomy of the independent voter. While hyperpolarization has driven straight-ticket voting to historic highs among partisans, with roughly 90 to 98% of highly ideological voters strictly backing their parties slate down the ballot, independent voters actively rejected absolute party loyalty. Nationwide, 9.7% of self-identified independents cast split ballots, voting for a presidential candidate from one party and a U.S. Senate candidate from the opposing party. This was nearly double the split ticket rate of affiliated Democrats, 4.9%, and Republicans, 4.9%. In the crucial swing states, this nonconformist behavior was even more pronounced. For instance, in Nevada, an astonishing 11% of independents split their tickets, while rates in Michigan, 8.6%, and Pennsylvania, 8.5%, heavily influenced the outcomes of crucial down-ballot races. Voting cohort national ticket splitting rate, 2024, independent voters, 9.7%. Democratic voters, 4.9%, Republican voters, 4.9%. Asterisk Table 5, ticket splitting rates in the 2024 general election asterisk. Furthermore, 2.9% of independents abstained entirely from voting in Senate races, undervoting, showcasing a willingness to leave ballots blank rather than endorse candidates they deemed unacceptable. This ticket-splitting behavior serves as a vital constitutional check on single-party dominance. By voting for Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, but frequently backing Democratic Senate candidates, or vice versa, independents strategically divided government power. They successfully utilized the ballot box to demand moderation, effectively telling the political establishment that they were hiring candidates for specific legislative roles, not endorsing blanket partisan mandates. This calculated refusal to yield to partisan uniformity is precisely why they are labeled controversial. The safety valve and the engine of policy innovation. The dominant narrative promoted by major parties frames independent candidates and their voters as malicious spoilers who degrade the efficiency of democracy. However, political scientists and historians offer a robust defense of third-party participation, arguing that they perform vital democratic functions that the two-party system is fundamentally incapable of executing on its own. Rather than being mere disruptors, independent movements serve as critical safety valves for societal tension and essential engines of policy innovation. The safety valve theory of dissent. The safety valve theory posits that in a healthy, functioning democracy, citizens must possess peaceful, institutional mechanisms to express extreme displeasure with the government and the political establishment. When the major parties become overly entrenched, unresponsive to public crises, or ideologically indistinguishable to certain segments of the population, voters experience profound alienation. If the electoral system denies these voters a peaceful outlet for their dissent, either through restricted ballot access or overwhelming social pressure to conform, their frustration risks boiling over into civil disruption, widespread protests, or total democratic disengagement. Independent and third-party candidacies act as this crucial safety valve. They provide a legitimate, ballot-based mechanism for alienated citizens to register a protest vote. By casting a ballot for an independent or a third party, voters signal their intense dissatisfaction without resorting to extra-constitutional measures or political violence. For example, during periods of severe economic depression and rapid industrialization in the late 19th century, agrarian and labor movements channeled their rage into the populist and greenback parties, utilizing the electoral system to demand redress. The existence of the controversial party, the collective outlet for independent frustration, is thus a stabilizing force that protects the broader democratic infrastructure from the toxic pressures of hyperpartisanship. Policy innovation and the amoeba effect. Beyond merely venting frustration, independent movements force the calcified major parties to evolve. In a two-party system, the primary objective of the major factions is risk aversion. They naturally gravitate toward ambiguity and avoid taking decisive, forward-looking stances on controversial issues that might alienate their moderate base or corporate donors. Consequently, policy innovation within the duopoly often stagnates. Third parties, unburdened by the immediate necessity of capturing a 51% national majority, have the freedom to introduce radical, necessary, or highly specific policy proposals into the public discourse. Historically, many of the foundational policies of the modern American state were first championed by minor parties operating on the political fringe before being co-opted by the mainstream. The abolition of slavery, Liberty Party, women's suffrage and child labor laws, Progressive Party, the Progressive Income Tax, Populist Party, and even the procedural innovation of the National Nominating Convention, Anti-Masonic Party, all originated outside the traditional duopoly. When a third party proves that a specific issue has significant electoral appeal, as Ross Perot did with the federal deficit in 1992, the major parties are forced to adapt to survive. Historians frequently describe the major parties as amoebas that respond to the threat of independent challengers by shifting their own platforms to absorb the fringe groups and their specific policy demands. In this sense, the independent voter acts as an accountability engine. By actively threatening to withhold their vote and direct it toward a third party, independents break the cartel-like complacency of the major parties, forcing them to earn support by adopting innovative solutions to neglected problems. Without the controversial disruption provided by independent voters, the two-party system would devolve into total stagnation. Structural remedies, accommodating the controversial electorate. The escalating friction between a rigid two-party duopoly and a massive, fluid independent electorate has generated unsustainable levels of political toxicity. As long as the American electoral system utilizes zero-sum, winner-take-all mechanics and restricted primary access, independent voters will continue to be demonized as spoilers, and third parties will be targeted for legal extermination. To resolve this democratic crisis and channel the energy of the controversial party into constructive governance, profound structural electoral reforms are imperative. Ranked choice voting and the elimination of spoilers. The most immediate and effective structural remedy to the spoiler effect is the widespread adoption of ranked choice voting, RCV, also known as instant runoff voting. Under RCV, voters are not restricted to selecting a single choice. Instead, they rank candidates in order of preference: first choice, second choice, third choice, etc. If no candidate secures an absolute mathematical majority of first-place votes in the initial round, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated. The votes cast for the eliminated candidate are then instantly redistributed to those voters' second choices, a process that continues through successive rounds until a candidate achieves a true majority. RCV fundamentally rewires the psychology and mathematics of voting. It entirely eliminates the wasted vote syndrome, allowing independent voters to cast their primary ballot for an alternative candidate, such as a libertarian or green, without the fear of inadvertently electing their least preferred major party candidate. By neutralizing the mathematical threat of the spoiler effect, RCV strips the duopoly of its primary rhetorical weapon against third parties. It fosters a significantly more civil political environment, as candidates are structurally incentivized to campaign for second-choice rankings from their opponents' supporters rather than relying exclusively on negative polarization and mudslinging. Final five voting and nonpartisan open primaries. To address the massive disenfranchisement caused by closed primary systems, electoral reformers fiercely advocate for transitioning to nonpartisan, top two, top four, or final five open primaries. In a final five system, all candidates, regardless of their political party affiliation, compete on a single, unified primary ballot that is open to all registered voters, including the estimated 27 million independents currently locked out of the traditional process. The top five vote-getters advance to the general election, which is then decided using ranked choice voting. This specific reform directly targets the root causes of the two-party doom loop. By decoupling candidate selection from closed, highly partisan bases, it dilutes the disproportionate power of extreme ideological factions. Candidates must appeal to the broad, pragmatic center of the electorate to survive the primary and win the general election, directly aligning the behavioral incentives of politicians with the moderate, solution-oriented values of the independent majority. Fusion voting and proportional representation. For a more profound and permanent realignment of the American political system, the structural integration of multi-party dynamics is required. Fusion voting, a historical practice that was largely outlawed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, specifically to suppress the power of third parties, allows a single candidate to be nominated by multiple political parties and appear on the ballot under different party lines. The votes from all lines are then aggregated to determine the winner. Fusion voting provides independent and centrist voters a distinct institutional voice without risking a spoiler scenario. A moderate voter could, for instance, support a mainstream Democratic or Republican candidate on an independent centrist ballot line, signaling their specific values and leveraging their collective voting power to influence the candidate's policy agenda. However, long-term Democratic stability may ultimately require transitioning from single-member districts to proportional representation, a system successfully utilized by the vast majority of modern Western democracies. By allocating legislative seats in direct proportion to the total vote share received by each party, proportional representation shatters the binary monopoly. It naturally facilitates a vibrant multi-party ecosystem where new, highly specific parties can form, campaign, and win actual legislative representation without having to conquer an insurmountable 51% threshold in a specific geographic district. This model transforms disruptive, independent movements into viable, institutionalized coalition partners, fostering a culture of consensus building and parliamentary compromise that the American system currently lacks. ## conclusion. The proposition that the independent electorate should be recognized as the controversial party captures the profound dissonance at the heart of modern American democracy. The political infrastructure of the United States was engineered to sustain a rigid two-party equilibrium, richly rewarding partisan loyalty and aggressively punishing ideological deviation. Yet, the electorate itself has fundamentally evolved beyond these constraints. Driven by generational shifts away from institutional trust, economic pragmatism, and deep-seated frustration with hyperpolarization, independent voters have swelled to encompass nearly half the voting public, dwarfing the bases of both the Republican and Democratic parties. Because they operate outside the controlled environments and predictable dogmas of the partisan organizations, independents introduce necessary chaos into a system that demands absolute predictability. When they flex their autonomy, either by splitting their tickets across party lines or rallying behind third-party candidates, they expose the mathematical vulnerabilities of plurality voting. They trigger the spoiler effect, dictate the outcomes of national elections, and force the political establishment into a state of panic. In response, the major parties have labeled them as agitators and spoilers, utilizing intense negative rhetoric and sophisticated legal warfare to suppress their ballot access and maintain the cartel. However, branding independent voters as dangerous or disruptive is a fundamental misdiagnosis of their democratic function. They are not the antagonists of the political system. They are its essential immune response. By refusing to submit to a binary choice that fails to represent their material interests, independents act as safety valves for societal discontent and engines for necessary policy innovation. They force accountability onto complacent institutions, wielding their fluidity and massive numbers to demand pragmatic solutions over tribal warfare. The turbulence associated with independent voters is not an inherent flaw of the voters themselves, but the inevitable symptom of an antiquated electoral architecture straining to contain a dynamic, modern population. Resolving this controversy does not require suppressing the independent voice, but rather implementing systemic structural reforms, such as ranked choice voting, open nonpartisan primaries, and proportional representation, that translate their immense numbers into legitimate, constructive representation. Until the system adapts to properly accommodate them, the independent voter will remain the most controversial, disruptive, and ultimately decisive force in American politics.